May 13, 1943. The sun hung low over the shattered hills of Tunisia. Across the burning sand, the once proud banners of the Afrikaner Corps were being lowered for the final time. For 2 years they had fought the British Eighth Army from Tobruk to El Alamein, carving their legend into the dunes. But now the Desert Fox was gone, recalled to Europe. His successor, General Jürgen von Arnim, stood before the ruins of his command, faced with the choice that no German general ever wished to make: unconditional surrender. That afternoon the order went out. All German and Italian units were to lay down their arms. By nightfall, over 250,000 Axis soldiers had surrendered to the Allies, the largest capitulation in German military history until that moment. Among them were the veterans of the Afrikaner Corps, men who had once driven the British to the gates of Egypt, now standing in dusty lines under the pitiless North African sun. Among those prisoners was Oberleutnant Friedrich Radke, decorated with the Iron Cross First Class. His diary, recovered decades later from the U.S. National Archives, would become one of the most vivid testaments to what followed. Not the brutality of captivity, but the shock of discovery. At first, the prisoners were gathered in makeshift camps near Oran, Algeria. They expected punishment, humiliation, perhaps even starvation, for that was how the Wehrmacht treated its captives. Instead, what awaited them was the first crack in the great Nazi illusion. Radke wrote, "They processed us with precision, but not cruelty. Every man photographed, recorded, examined by doctors. They gave us injections against typhus, and spoke in perfect German about our rights under the Geneva Convention. We thought it was propaganda. But it wasn't. It was simply American bureaucracy, efficient, mechanical, humane." Then came the second shock, the food. Obergefreiter Hans Moeller of the 21st Panzer Division wrote home months later, "At Oran, while waiting for the ships, the Americans fed us better than we had eaten in 6 months of war. White bread, real coffee, meat twice a day. We thought it was a trick, that they were fattening us for labor or interrogation. Only later did we realize this was their standard military ration." The men who had been told America was a decadent, collapsing society found themselves eating food their families in Hamburg could no longer dream of. When the Liberty ships arrived to transport them across the Atlantic, the scale of American industry began to reveal itself. The prisoners learned that one of the ships, the SS Robert E. Peary, had been built in just 4 days and 15 hours at the Kaiser shipyards in California, a feat that would have been dismissed as a propaganda lie in Germany. At the height of the war, the United States was producing 3 of these 14,000-ton cargo ships per day. And now those ships, once carrying tanks, ammunition, and fuel, would carry human cargo. Up to 30,000 German prisoners of war each month to camps in the American heartland. For the men of the Afrikaner Corps, the voyage across the Atlantic was the first stage of an unexpected education. Feldwebel Kurt Zimmermann of the 90th Light Division kept a secret diary during the 2-week crossing. He wrote, "The sailors throw away more food each day than our company received in a week. Half-eaten steaks, whole loaves of bread, milk poured overboard. Not as mockery, simply because to them this waste meant nothing. Their supply was endless. The German soldiers had been taught America was weak, a mongrel nation ruled by Jews and capitalists, too soft to fight. Yet here, even the crewmen of a cargo ship seemed to live in abundance unimaginable in the Reich." The real shock came when the coastline of America appeared through the morning mist. Norfolk, Virginia, August 2, 1943. The port stretched for miles. Cranes the size of fortresses moved effortlessly along electric rails, lifting tons of cargo with machine precision. In a single day, this one port handled more shipping tonnage than all of Hamburg in a week. Unteroffizier Johann Weber, once a factory worker in the Ruhr, counted 47 ships being loaded and unloaded simultaneously. Each crane, he wrote, did the work of 50 men. No horses, no shouting, only the hum of electricity. It was like watching an industrial symphony. The shock was cultural, spiritual, and ideological. These were the same men who had been told America was unorganized and lazy. Yet everything before them, the cranes, the railways, the port infrastructure, spoke of a civilization that had mastered the art of mass production.
June 4, 1943. Railroad Street, Mexia, Texas. The evening air was thick with humidity and the scent of oil from nearby garricks. The citizens of Mexia, shopkeepers, school children, veterans too old for this war, lined the platform as the long silver train rolled to a stop. Inside, behind barred Pullman windows, sat 1,850 captured veterans of the Africa Corps, still in faded tan uniforms, their collars stiff with desert salt. They expected boxcars, straw floors, hunger. What they found instead would dismantle 3 years of Nazi propaganda more effectively than any Allied leaflet. Obergefreiter Werner Burkhardt wrote in his secret diary that night, "We thought America was collapsing, but through the train window I saw light, miles and miles of electric light. Every farmhouse, every street corner, every window was shining. It was 10 p.m., and still everything glowed. In Germany, we live in darkness. Here, even the smallest town shines like a city." The American South, electrified by the New Deal's Rural Electrification Administration, was ablaze with the energy of the modern world. To men who had fought for Hitler's dream of technological destiny, the sight was almost theological. The train cars themselves deepened the shock. Not cattle wagons, not the grim 40-and-8 cars, 40 men or 8 horses, that had carried German soldiers across Europe, but full Pullman coaches, padded seats that folded into bunks, dining cars with silver cutlery, observation cars with wide glass windows. When the guards apologized that the air conditioning was broken, Lieutenant Radke, the Iron Cross veteran, simply stared in disbelief. Air conditioning? On a prison train? The journey from Norfolk, Virginia to Texas lasted 3 days. For the prisoners, it became a slow-motion revelation. As the train rumbled through Virginia, Tennessee, and Kentucky, they pressed their faces to the glass and saw something no German village could match: abundance. Every town they passed, Danville, Greensboro, Knoxville, was illuminated deep into the night. Shop windows filled with goods, neon signs advertising Coca-Cola and Goodyear. Even in the early hours, factories were running full shifts. Parking lots were filled with hundreds of cars. Obergefreiter Mueller, the son of a Nazi Party official, wrote in a letter later discovered in 1987, "I called the guard a liar when he said every American town had electricity since the 1920s. Then we stopped in Roanoke. I saw coal loaders working by electric light, water pumps, mechanized systems that did in half an hour what would take 2 hours in Germany. I realized he had not lied. Our whole ideology had." At one yard, prisoners saw railway workers in denim overalls smoking cigarettes and drinking Coca-Cola, luxuries in Germany, even for officers. They threw half-finished cigarettes away without a thought. The casualness of wealth stunned the observers. Feldwebel Heinrich Müller, once an electrical engineer in Berlin, calculated that a single American rail yard consumed more power in 1 hour than his entire district at home used in a day. He wrote, "They waste electricity like we waste lives, and yet it is beautiful." When the train crossed into Tennessee, the window scenes turned industrial. They passed the Alcoa aluminum plant, its furnaces glowing red in the night. The plant consumed 175,000 kilowatts of power, more than the whole city of Munich. Then came Louisville's Rubbertown complex, 4 vast factories producing 800,000 tons of synthetic rubber annually, 6 times what Germany managed in its best year. Oberleutnant Erich Hoffmann, a chemist from IG Farben, recognized the structures instantly. He recalled after the war, "They were using our own technology, but on a scale that dwarfed anything we imagined possible, and they did it in 18 months." Outside Detroit, the prisoners glimpsed the Willow Run plant, Henry Ford's monumental factory where a B-24 Liberator bomber rolled off the line every 63 minutes. Even from the train, they could see the shimmering aluminum shapes of half-built aircraft stretching to the horizon. "We were told American planes were crude, inferior," remembered Luftwaffe pilot Werner Vokel. But the precision of those assembly lines, those machines, showed me a nation that had turned production itself into a weapon. By the time the train reached the Mississippi River, the psychological collapse of Nazi certainty had begun. The men who had believed Germany was the world's industrial master now realized they were looking at an empire of machinery that Germany could never match. Crossing the great river at St. Louis, they saw barges carrying wheat, corn, and steel in endless lines. Each grain elevator they passed could feed a German city for months. In Kansas City, they watched American workers eating thick meat sandwiches during their break. Gefreiter Paul Fischer wrote, "They eat meat as we eat bread." No, that is wrong. They eat meat as we wish we could eat bread. When a guard bought 20 hamburgers for the group, meat, cheese, vegetables, white bread, and paid with a single $1 bill, Fischer recorded simply, "That was the moment I knew we could never win this war." After 3 days, the train slowed as they approached Camp Hearn, Texas, one of more than 500 POW camps built across America. The prisoners braced themselves for punishment. What they awaited instead was the first full contact with the industrial democracy that had defeated them. Wooden barracks lined in perfect symmetry stretched across the Texas plains. Each had electric light, flush toilets, hot showers, and steam heating, luxuries even German officers rarely saw. Dr. Friedrich Bauer, a captured army surgeon, could hardly believe the camp hospital. They had X-ray machines, surgical tools finer than ours, and medicine we only heard rumors of, penicillin. They used it even for minor wounds. In Germany, soldiers were dying for lack of sulfur drugs. Here, the Americans gave us miracles. Even the kitchen was a revelation. Walk-in refrigerators, electric mixers, gas ranges, enough food for thousands of men. When prisoners assigned to kitchen duty realized they were required to prepare 10% extra food by regulation to guarantee full rations, they wept as they threw away untouched loaves of bread. "We discarded more food in a day than my family had seen in 3 years," Feldwebel Otto Krebs wrote. The waste was not arrogance, it was abundance. Within weeks, those same men would begin working in the fields and factories of America, unarmed witnesses to the true arsenal of democracy. But that first night in Texas, as they lay in barracks lit by electric bulbs humming softly overhead, the most powerful weapon of all was already at work, the quiet shock of prosperity.
By September 1943, the war in Europe had reached its deadliest phase. But in the heart of Texas, something unexpected was happening. Thousands of German prisoners, veterans of the Afrika Korps, Luftwaffe pilots, and engineers from the shattered armies of North Africa were waking each morning under the wide American sky and discovering a world that defied every word of Nazi propaganda. The labor shortage caused by the mobilization of over 12 million Americans had forced the U.S. government to employ prisoners of war in civilian industries. It was a pragmatic decision, one that would quietly dismantle years of ideological indoctrination. Every dawn, groups of German prisoners climbed into trucks marked U.S. Army Prisoner Detail. They rode through the vast heartland of America, endless plains of wheat, oceans of corn, factories smoking in the distance. There were no blindfolds, no secrecy, no guards with raised rifles. The Americans simply told them where to go, and they went. Gefreiter Herbert Lang, once a farmer from Thuringia, remembered his first day working at a cotton gin near Houston. "The machine did in 1 hour what our whole village could not do in a week. It was powered by electricity from a river hundreds of kilometers away. The farmer who owned it was no aristocrat, no party member, just a farmer. But he had running water, a truck, and a car. Even his black workers ate more than German soldiers. It was then I began to understand this country was not rich because it conquered, it was rich because it produced." In Nebraska, prisoners working in the sugar beet fields saw combines devour acres of crops with mechanical precision. Each harvester replaced 100 men. The farmers spoke casually of yields of 60 bushels per acre, double Germany's best harvests. One of the prisoners, Wilhelm Hoffmann, wrote home in disbelief.
The farmer's son, a boy of 16, drives a tractor worth more than everything my father ever owned. He told me it wasn't even a good one, that they're waiting for the new John Deere model. I thought he was joking. He wasn't. The psychological transformation was spreading like a quiet contagion. At a Campbell's soup factory in New Jersey, prisoners assigned to labor watched an assembly line of women and elderly men produce more food in one day than their pre-war factories in Germany could in a month. The line ran on electric belts, steam cookers, and automated sealing machines, all controlled by a single woman sipping coffee and listening to the radio. Stabsfeldwebel Ernst Wagner, who had managed a food plant in Saxony before the war, recorded the moment with astonishment. They do not shout, they do not beat the workers. The machinery obeys, and they treat it as if it were a friend. They live with their machines. We enslaved ours. Across the industrial north, prisoners were assigned to unload coal, package food, and stack lumber. Near Detroit, they saw the River Rouge complex, a cathedral of industry employing over 100,000 men and women. There, jeeps, tanks, and aircraft engines rolled off the line in unbroken rhythm. Obergefarcher Franz Kellner, once a factory worker in Hamburg, described it in a letter smuggled through Red Cross channels. At the Rouge plant, I saw a city that eats coal and breathes steel. The parking lots are filled with thousands of cars, belonging not to officers or engineers, but to workers. The guards told us some owned 2 cars. We thought he mocked us. He wasn't mocking. These observations reached American intelligence analysts monitoring the camps. Reports from the Office of the Provost Marshal General noted a phenomenon they called ideological collapse syndrome. The Nazi worldview, built on scarcity, hierarchy, and obedience, was unraveling in contact with the ordinary abundance of American life. Major Paul Noland, who oversaw the Special Projects Division, a covert re-education program for German POWs, wrote in his December 1943 memo, "They have seen too much. The most fanatical Nazis no longer argue about superiority. They still call themselves soldiers of the Reich, but now they ask questions. They want to know how our farmers have tractors, how our workers own cars, how our women run factories. They're beginning to doubt everything Goebbels ever told them." Inside the camps, those doubts found voice. Prisoner-run newspapers like Der Ruf, The Call, began as defiant nationalist bulletins. By late 1943, they were printing essays on democracy, economics, and human rights. Editorials spoke not of Hitler's destiny, but of what Germany must learn after defeat. Lieutenant Hermann Gotz, captured at Tunis, wrote, "We were told America was a mongrel nation ruled by money and Jews. But every day I am here, I see the opposite. This is the most organized, powerful, and united society I have ever witnessed. If this is decadence, then decadence is strength." The prisoners' greatest shock came not from power or machinery, but from mercy. After Italy surrendered in September 1943, Italian prisoners who agreed to work for the Allies were given better rations and more freedom. They wore American uniforms marked Italian Service Unit and worked alongside U.S. soldiers. The German prisoners were stunned. Oberlieutenant Friedrich Schultz recorded bitterly, "They betrayed us, yet they eat in restaurants, work for wages, and walk without guards. We who fought loyally for Germany remain prisoners. The Americans treat traitors better than comrades, and yet, somehow, I cannot hate them for it." Christmas 1943 delivered the final blow to Nazi ideology. Across the country, American churches and civic groups sent 500,000 Christmas packages to German prisoners. Inside, cigarettes, candy, toiletries, playing carts. Local choirs came to the camps to sing carols in German. The Boy Scouts delivered handmade holiday cards. Women from nearby towns baked cakes and cookies for men who, months earlier, had tried to kill their sons and husbands. Feldwebel Hans Albrecht, a former paratrooper from Bremen, could only write, "They know who we are. They know what we have done. Yet they feed us like brothers. I do not understand this country." The camp kitchens served feasts that German civilians had not seen since before the Great War. Turkey, ham, mashed potatoes, vegetables, pies, and ice cream. The guards told the prisoners that it was the same meal every American family would eat that night. Gefreiter Hans Weber later said in an interview, "If they can feed their enemies like this, how do they feed their own soldiers?" We realized that this was not propaganda. This was power, power born of plenty. For the German prisoners, the revelation was complete. America's weapon was not its bombs or its guns or even its factories. It was the effortless confidence of a society that could show generosity to its enemies because it was certain of its own strength. That winter, under the electric lights of Camp Hearn, hundreds of captured Nazis lay awake and began to question not just their defeat, but the very beliefs they had once killed for.
By early 1944, the German prisoners scattered across the United States had entered a new phase of captivity, one that was less about confinement and more about conversion. What began as containment had evolved into an experiment. Could democracy re-educate the soldiers of dictatorship? The answer would come not from lectures or propaganda, but from something far more powerful: observation. At Camp Shelby in Mississippi, at Fort Kearny in Rhode Island, and at Camp Hearn in Texas, classrooms appeared inside the barbed wire. Chalkboards were mounted, desks assembled, and German prisoners, officers, engineers, farmers, and clerks sat in neat rows as American instructors taught them English, mathematics, history, and economics. They were not forced. They volunteered. By spring, over 40,000 German prisoners had enrolled in educational courses. The University of Chicago provided correspondence lessons. Professors from Stanford and Columbia traveled to the camps to lecture on democracy and modern science. To men who had been taught that intellectualism was weakness, it was a revelation. Dr. Wilhelm von Braun, a physicist conscripted from the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, later recalled, "The professors, some of them Jewish refugees from Germany, taught us without bitterness. They spoke of science as something that belonged to all humanity. Their generosity shamed us. I realized that what the Nazis had destroyed was not just morality, but the spirit of learning itself." In libraries built by the YMCA and the Red Cross, prisoners read English-language newspapers and books. They discovered that American media printed open criticism of its own government, something unthinkable in the Reich. They watched debates in Congress on newsreels, saw dissenting politicians speak freely, and realized that disagreement was not weakness, it was the system's strength. Lieutenant Josef Kramer wrote in his diary, "They show their failures to the world and call it honesty. In Germany, we hide our failures and call it strength. Now I see which nation will endure." Camp theaters screened Hollywood films, Gone with the Wind, The Grapes of Wrath, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. The Americans did not hide their flaws, they dramatized them. To the prisoners, it was incomprehensible that a country at war would allow its enemies to see movies about poverty, corruption, and injustice. But over time, they understood. This transparency was a sign of confidence, not decay. At Camp Kearny, the prisoner newspaper Der Ruf, The Call, shifted dramatically in tone. Once filled with military nostalgia, it began publishing essays about rebuilding Germany through democracy. Articles explored the U.S. Constitution, the separation of powers, and the economic principles behind the New Deal. One editor, Lieutenant Hans Meyer, explained, "We realized that propaganda had to be replaced by understanding. We wanted to know how a nation could remain free and still organized, wealthy yet compassionate, powerful but without tyranny." Outside the camps, American civilians continued to astonish their captives with small gestures of kindness. Farmers who employed German laborers invited them into their homes for lunch. Local churches organized concerts, sometimes even in German, to lift the spirits of prisoners.
In Iowa, farmers' wives sent extra pie slices back with the guards for the boys from across the ocean. For soldiers raised on the doctrine that mercy was weakness, such humanity was disarming. Oberleutnant Walter Müller, whose brother had been killed in the bombing of Hamburg, wrote, "They know I am their enemy, yet they speak to me as a man. They say they are fighting Hitler, not Germans. I did not believe such distinctions existed. Now I see that they mean it." The Special Projects Division, a secret branch of the Office of the Provost Marshal General, quietly nurtured this transformation. Their approach was subtle. No forced indoctrination, no slogans, no propaganda films. Instead, they gave the prisoners choices: books, lectures, discussions, and trusted curiosity to do the rest. Major Paul Noland, in a classified 1944 memo, described the results. The men are not coerced. They are shown a working democracy and invited to study it. They see that the machinery of freedom functions efficiently, without fear. Their faith in authoritarianism is eroding not through argument, but through evidence. By mid-1944, the American government estimated that fewer than 10% of the prisoners still held strong Nazi beliefs. The transformation was measurable. Camp newspapers now featured essays on civil rights and the dangers of militarism. Discussion groups debated post-war reconstruction. Prisoners who once believed Hitler's New Order was destiny were now writing essays about cooperative economics and federal governments. At Camp Concordia in Kansas, a prisoner debate club discussed the topic, "Which form of government ensures lasting peace?" The winning argument, delivered by a former Wehrmacht sergeant, concluded simply, "The one where no man fears to speak." Meanwhile, news of the war filtered through the camps. D-Day, the liberation of Paris, the fall of Aachen. For many, pride gave way to grief, but also to perspective. As reports arrived of Germany's collapse, the educational programs accelerated. The American instructors told the prisoners, "You will go home soon. You will help rebuild your country. You must decide what kind of Germany that will be." One prisoner, a former teacher named Friedrich von Tauben, later wrote, "They prepared us not for surrender, but for citizenship. The Americans wanted us to rebuild, not to hate." The re-education effort culminated in a symbolic Christmas celebration in December 1944. At Camp Hearn, prisoners and guards attended a joint concert. The choir sang Stille Nacht in both German and English. The camp commander addressed the men directly. "Someday you will go home. When you do, remember this: mercy is not weakness, and strength is not cruelty. What you have seen here is what freedom looks like." That night, in the quiet of the barracks, many of the men cried for the first time in years, not from sorrow, but from something new: understanding. The men who had arrived believing they were the master race now realized they had been servants. Servants of lies, marching for a dream that had turned to ash. In America, behind barbed wire, they found something their empire never possessed: the dignity of equality.
By the summer of 1944, the quiet ideological war fought inside America's prison camps had already been won. The Nazi faith, built on myths of racial superiority and technical dominance, was collapsing, not under artillery fire, but under the weight of American abundance. Every week, new groups of German prisoners were transported across the heartland to work in fields, factories, and warehouses. They became unwilling witnesses to the most extraordinary industrial phenomenon in history: the transformation of a democracy into a war machine without losing its humanity. At the Higgins Boat Factory in New Orleans, German prisoners watched American workers, men, women, and even teenagers, assembled the small landing craft that would soon carry Allied troops onto the beaches of Normandy.
The prisoners were stunned not just by the speed of production, 700 boats per month, but by who was doing the work. Stabsfeldwebel Kurt Zimmermann recorded in his notebook, "I saw Negroes operating cranes, women welding hulls, boys barely 16 drilling holes in steel. Everything we were told was impossible in a democracy. Yet the plant never stopped. 3 shifts, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They produced more in a month than our Navy built in a year." At Republic Steel in Ohio, they saw blast furnaces glowing like captured suns, each pouring out 10,000 tons of steel daily. Endless trains of iron ore from Minnesota and coal from Pennsylvania fed the furnaces without pause. The prisoners stared as sparks cascaded like fireworks across the night sky. Obergefreiter Paul Hartmann, who had once worked at Krupp before the war, later said, "I thought I understood industry. I had seen the Ruhr. But this was another planet. They wasted more steel and spillage than we could produce in a week, and the workers complained about overtime." The German mind, trained to equate discipline with efficiency, could not comprehend an economy that was both free and more productive than any dictatorship. When news of the Normandy landings reached the camps in June 1944, the transformation accelerated. Prisoners crowded around radios and newspapers, reading the numbers in stunned silence. 6,000 ships, 11,000 aircraft, 150,000 men in the first wave. Feldwebel Otto Klein recalled, "We realized then that the war was over, not militarily, but spiritually. No nation could organize that scale of operation unless it had mastered not only war, but civilization itself." At Camp Shelby, the prisoners watched newsreels of the invasion, armadas stretching to the horizon, artificial harbors built from steel and ingenuity, endless convoys pouring across the English Channel. The men who had once believed in Hitler's invincible Reich now saw the truth. Their enemy was not decadent, it was inexhaustible. Each American soldier who landed at Normandy was backed by a factory, a farm, and a system that never slept. Across the Midwest, prisoners working in agriculture witnessed the same phenomenon on the land. In Kansas, they saw wheat harvests conducted with industrial precision. Combines moved across the plains like metallic ships, each capable of harvesting 100 acres per day. The grain elevators they filled could store more wheat than Germany imported in a year. Gefreiter Franz Weber, a farmer from East Prussia, described the shock. "One American farmer with machines does the work of 100 of us. They could lose half their harvest and still feed Europe. They have conquered hunger the way we tried to conquer nations." In California's Central Valley, prisoners were assigned to fruit orchards stretching beyond the horizon. There they witnessed something almost sacrilegious to men from war-ravaged Europe: abundance destroyed intentionally. Mountains of oranges were bulldozed into pits simply to stabilize prices. Unteroffizier Otto Schultz wrote, "We begged them to send the fruit to Germany, to our starving families. The guards were kind, but explained it was not possible. I realized then what victory meant, not just to win battles, but to have so much that you could afford to waste it." In the autumn of 1944, the Special Projects Division intensified its re-education campaign. The prisoners were shown maps of industrial America, steel plants in Pittsburgh, auto factories in Detroit, oil refineries in Texas, shipyards in California. The goal was not to humiliate them, but to help them understand why Germany could never win a war against such power. Major Nolan summarized it simply in a report to Washington. "They no longer believe in the 1,000-year Reich. They believe in electricity." As winter approached, the men who once prayed to Hitler began studying the U.S. Constitution. They read Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, and Abraham Lincoln. They began to see democracy not as weakness, but as a machine, complex, self-correcting, and unstoppable. That December, American newspapers printed the first reports from Europe describing the devastation of German cities under Allied bombing. The prisoners wept for their families, but few cursed their captors. They understood now that industrial war was not about cruelty, it was about capacity. In January 1945, American officers began showing the prisoners footage from liberated France and Belgium. Smiling civilians greeting Allied soldiers. Factories reopening, markets full of food. It was not propaganda. It was proof that democracy rebuilt faster than tyranny could destroy. And then, in April, came the images that no one could have prepared them for. The Americans screened film from Buchenwald and Dachau, the liberated concentration camps. Rows of corpses, survivors staring at the camera with hollow eyes, mountains of shoes and human ashes. At first, many German prisoners shouted that it was a lie. Some turned away, shaking with rage. But the evidence was undeniable. Letters from home confirmed it. Captured German doctors admitted it. Prisoners of conscience testified. Oberleutnant Walter Schmidt wrote later, "We thought we were warriors for civilization. We discovered we were servants of monsters." The Americans did not need to hate us. They only needed to show us what we had become. The psychological collapse was complete. Men who had arrived proud and defiant now begged to study American books, to attend classes, to understand how such a society could produce both mercy and power. The Americans treated even the broken with dignity. Prisoners who attempted suicide were given therapy, not punishment. Those suffering from trauma received medical care, not interrogation. Dr. Friedrich Bauer, the camp surgeon, described it with awe. They treat madness with compassion. They heal their enemies. That is when I understood that this nation's strength comes not from its weapons, but from its humanity. By the spring of 1945, more than 25,000 German prisoners had volunteered for democracy courses. Camp newspapers published editorials supporting free elections and labor rights. Former officers discussed how to rebuild Germany's economy and agricultural system along American lines. As the war in Europe ended, these men, once instruments of fascism, had become students of democracy. The Reich had sent soldiers to conquer the world. America had turned them into witnesses of freedom.
May 19, 1945. Across Europe, the guns fell silent. Hitler was dead, Berlin was in ruins, and the Third Reich, the self-proclaimed empire that would last 1,000 years, had vanished in 12. Yet in the United States, behind the fences of more than 500 prison camps, a quieter revolution was already complete. The men who had once sworn loyalty to Hitler were now preparing to return home, not as conquerors, but as builders. At Camp Hearn, Camp Shelby, and dozens of others, the American guards gathered the prisoners for one final address. The war was over, the officers told them. Soon they would go home. But their task was not finished. "You will rebuild your country," one camp commander said, "and you will remember what you have seen here. You have seen the power of a free people. Now go and make your nation free." The Americans meant it literally. Over the next year, they began training the POWs in trades and professions essential to reconstruction. Agricultural courses taught soil management, irrigation, and modern mechanization techniques. Factory workers studied logistics and machine maintenance. Others learned English, bookkeeping, and even civics. The intent was simple: to return Germany not broken, but enlightened. By late 1945, more than 371,000 German prisoners had been repatriated from U.S. camps. They returned to a country that barely existed, a wasteland of rubble, hunger, and shame. The cities they remembered were gone. The currency was worthless. The Reich's promises of glory had turned to ashes. But many brought back something new, an idea of what a functioning, humane, and prosperous society could be.
Oberleutnant Friedrich von Tauben, who had attended classes at Camp Shelby, described it in his memoir. "They treated us not as beasts, but as men. They gave us knowledge, books, and dignity. We returned to Germany with more than defeat. We returned with a vision." In the ruins of Hamburg, Cologne, and Frankfurt, those visions began to take form. Former prisoners took jobs as teachers, engineers, and agricultural supervisors in the new Allied-administered zones. They introduced crop rotation methods they had learned in Texas, mechanical farming techniques seen in Kansas, and efficiency systems copied from American factories. They spoke of the Marshall Plan before it even had a name. When the European Recovery Program was officially announced in 1948, its core philosophy, that economic prosperity was the foundation of peace, was already familiar to thousands of ex-prisoners who had witnessed the same logic in America. The transformation was personal as well as political. Dr. Wilhelm von Braun, the physicist who had attended American lectures on atomic energy, helped establish new technical institutes in post-war Germany. Hans Kroll, once a prisoner at Camp Shelby, became West Germany's ambassador to the United States. Walter Hallstein, who had taught classes for fellow prisoners at Camp Como, would become the first president of the European Commission. Others contributed more quietly. Farmers who had once fought in the Afrika Korps rebuilt rural Germany using American equipment and ideas. Engineers who had labored in POW machine shops helped restart German manufacturing. Teachers who had studied English in prison classrooms introduced democratic civics into new curricula. Obergeifreiter Hans Beer, who had worked on Iowa farms, said at a reunion decades later, "The Americans taught me more with a handshake than the Nazis did with a decade of speeches. They showed me that strength was not about domination, but cooperation." For many, the return home was bittersweet. The country they had fought for no longer existed, but the lessons they carried became the seed of something greater, a democratic Germany that would rise from the ruins. Between 1946 and 1950, West Germany's new institutions were shaped by men who had seen America firsthand. They understood mass production, logistics, mechanization, and the management of human capital. More importantly, they understood the moral foundation that made such systems sustainable: individual dignity and freedom. Historians later called this phenomenon the education of the enemy. It was one of the most successful Reformation programs in modern history, accomplished without coercion, without brainwashing, and without violence. Dr. Arnold Kramer, a historian of the U.S. War Department, summarized it: "The Germans were not converted by propaganda. They were converted by plumbing, by electricity, by efficiency, by food. Every light bulb, every hot shower, and every honest wage was an argument against Nazism. They were not defeated, they were persuaded." By 1950, Germany's economic recovery, what would soon be known as the Wirtschaftswunder, or economic miracle, was underway. Many of its architects were former POWs who had seen the American model in action. Their new values, discipline without cruelty, efficiency without exploitation, strength without tyranny, became the DNA of modern West Germany. In 1985, 4 decades after the war, over 500 former German POWs returned to the United States for a reunion in Austin, Texas. They came as doctors, professors, diplomats, and businessmen. They visited the camps where they had once been imprisoned, now empty fields under the southern sun. At the reunion dinner, Dr. Hermann Goetz, once a Luftwaffe lieutenant, spoke for them all. "We came to America as enemies, filled with arrogance and hate. We left as students, filled with humility and hope. America showed us that true strength lies not in conquest, but in creation. You defeated us with compassion, we built us with knowledge, and gave us back our humanity. We will never forget it." When he finished, the entire hall, Americans and Germans alike, rose to their feet. For several long minutes, no one spoke. There were only tears and applause, and the quiet recognition that the greatest victory of the Second World War had not been won with bombs or tanks, but with example. The German prisoners had arrived in 1943 believing in their superiority. They left in 1946 believing in democracy. The journey from arrogance to understanding, from darkness to light, remains one of the most remarkable transformations in human history. The ships that had brought them across the Atlantic carried soldiers of the Third Reich. The ships that returned them to Europe carried citizens of the future. They had seen the power of freedom, and they would never unsee it.